The day progress quietly went into reverse. There were no protests, no bans, and no dramatic speeches warning a loss. Everything looked like improvement, and that is why almost no one noticed what was being undone. This story matters today because progress does not always collapse through force or backlash. Sometimes it reverses politely, wrapped in language about efficiency, reform, and modernization. The vocabulary of advancement is remarkably easy to repurpose. The same words that once described the construction of protections can later describe their removal. Efficiency, streamlining, flexibility. These terms carry positive connotations regardless of what they're applied to, and that linguistic neutrality makes them ideal instruments for disguising regression as improvement. At the time, the country believed it was fixing problems, simplifying systems, and correcting excesses created by earlier reforms. Leaders promised streamlining, balance, and a return to common sense after years of rapid change. The narrative was carefully constructed to position the reversals as corrections rather than retreats. The language of overcorrection was deployed to suggest that previous progress had gone too far, that the pendulum needed to swing back, and that moderation required undoing some of what had been achieved. The adjustments sounded reasonable. Regulations were revised, protections softened, and responsibilities shifted under the promise of flexibility and growth. Each individual change was presented as a minor technical adjustment, too small and too specific to warrant public debate. The cumulative direction of these changes was never articulated as a single policy, because doing so would have revealed a pattern that the incremental approach was designed to obscure. Most people welcomed the changes, because nothing felt taken away all at once. Benefits seemed marginal, losses abstract, and the direction appeared sensible. The psychological mechanism at work was the asymmetry between concentrated benefits and diffuse losses. Each revision delivered a small, identifiable benefit to a specific constituency while distributing its costs across a much larger population in ways that were individually imperceptible. What went unnoticed was how each revision quietly weakened safeguards that had taken decades to build. Progress was not being rejected, it was being diluted. The distinction matters because outright rejection would have provoked resistance. Dilution avoids that resistance by maintaining the appearance of protection while reducing its substance. The name remains, the law remains on the books, but its capacity to protect is diminished through amendment, reinterpretation, and reduced enforcement. Institutions adjusted, metrics improved, and officials celebrated success without questioning what had been traded to achieve it. The metrics that were used to evaluate the changes were carefully selected to reflect the intended benefits, while excluding the unintended costs. Performance measures that captured the strength of protections were quietly replaced by measures that captured the speed of processes, making the system appear to improve even as its protective capacity declined. The country was not moving forward anymore. It was slowly stepping backward, while calling it reform. As reforms continued, their cumulative effect became harder to track, because each change was small enough to appear harmless on its own. Protections were reclassified as obstacles, oversight reframed as inefficiency, and long-term safeguards labeled outdated. The reclassification was linguistic before it was legislative. By changing how protections were described in public discourse, leaders shifted the burden of justification from those seeking to remove protections to those seeking to preserve them. Defenders of existing safeguards found themselves arguing against efficiency, modernization, and common sense, a rhetorical position that was politically untenable. Institutions adapted quickly, optimizing for new priorities that valued speed and cost over resilience. The institutional response was rational within the new framework. Organizations that were rewarded for speed optimized for speed. Organizations that were penalized for cost optimized for cost reduction. The fact that speed and cost optimization came at the expense of resilience was not a failure of institutional behavior. It was an inevitable consequence of the incentive structure the reforms had created. Public debate faded as outcomes were presented through technical metrics rather than social impact. The technicalization of debate served to exclude non-expert voices from the conversation, reducing participation to those with the specialized knowledge required to engage with the metrics. This narrowing of the debate was not accidental. It was a predictable consequence of framing policy changes as technical rather than political decisions. Those most effective felt the change first, but struggled to explain it, because nothing dramatic had occurred. The experience of gradual loss is difficult to articulate because it lacks the narrative structure that dramatic events provide. There is no before and after moment, no villain, no clear act of deprivation. There is only a slow erosion of capacity that makes daily life incrementally harder without providing a clear target for complaint. The system was still functioning, just with fewer guardrails and weaker buffers against failure. The reduction in resilience was invisible under normal conditions. Guardrails and buffers are, by design, invisible when they're not needed. Their value becomes apparent only when stress arrives. And by the time stress arrived, the protections that would have absorbed it were no longer in place. Each revision made the next easier, as rollback became routine rather than controversial. The normalization of revision created a ratchet effect. Each reduction in protection lowered the baseline against which subsequent reductions were measured. What would have been considered a significant rollback relative to the original standard appeared as a minor adjustment relative to the already reduced standard. Progress had not been halted. It had been redefined downward, and the distance from where the country started was growing quietly. The conflict emerged when a new challenge tested the system and revealed how much had been quietly removed. Safeguards that once absorbed shock were gone, leaving individuals and institutions exposed. The absence of protection was felt most acutely by those with the least capacity to absorb the impact on their own. The distribution of vulnerability mapped directly onto the distribution of the costs that the reforms had diffused across the population. Public trust fractured as people realized that protections they assumed still existed had already been dismantled. The gap between assumed and actual protection was itself a source of harm, because people had made decisions, financial, professional, and personal, based on the assumption that safeguards were in place. The discovery that those safeguards had been removed retroactively invalidated the basis of those decisions. Leaders struggled to respond, because restoring what was lost required admitting that progress had moved in the wrong direction. The political cost of acknowledgement was high. Admitting that the reforms had been harmful meant accepting responsibility for the harm. And the leaders who had implemented the reforms were in many cases the same leaders now being asked to respond to their consequences. The buildup intensified as failures multiplied, no longer isolated but systemic. What once felt efficient now felt fragile, unable to protect those it was meant to serve. The illusion of improvement collapsed under pressure. Progress had not advanced. It had retreated, and the cost of that retreat was now undeniable. The climax arrived when society finally recognized that progress had not been stalled by opposition, but reversed through agreement. What was lost had not been taken by force, but given away in pieces. The resolution lies in understanding that reform must be measured not only by efficiency, but by what it preserves. Growth that weakens protection is not progress, it is trade-off. This story matters today because rollback often hides behind improvement, advancing quietly until resilience disappears. History reminds us that progress must be defended as actively as it is achieved. Once protections are gone, rebuilding them is far harder than preserving them. So, what do you think? Did we notice when progress began moving backward? The day